Welcome back to another Pirkei Avot text explication. I'm Rabbi Drew, and we are now on the 16th and final text in the second chapter of Pirkei Avot. Having heard in the previous video about Rabbi Tarfon and what he said, that seemed very similar to a statement of Hippocrates, we are now turning to something that he used to say. Now, these two statements of his share a little bit of a theme, which is about working, about effort, and about payment. These actually seem to be thematically connected to what we had seen in the text prior to that, a statement of Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, who talked about toil and reward. And just for some context, what Rabbi Elazar ben Arach had said, he had said three things, the third of which was, know before whom you toil, and you should trust that the person in charge of your work will repay you the payment, the remuneration for your efforts. That was the third of his three statements. And that seems to connect with what we had in the previous text from Rabbi Tarfon, and continuing on to the text we have in front of us today, a saying of Rabbi Tarfon. So here is what he has to say. This is what he used to say. Rabbi Tarfon used to say, and couched very stylistically in what we have seen of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's students, as well as what we saw in the first chapter, tripartite statement, a three-part piece of advice. The first, the work is not upon you to complete, yet you are also not free to desist from it. Interesting. I also think that we're going to see this is all really within the context of thinking about Torah study and Jewish practice. So in talking about, you don't need to finish everything, you don't need to complete everything, but that doesn't mean you can just walk away. Really interesting. Second, if you have learned a lot of Torah, if you've studied a lot of Torah, you'll be given a lot of reward. It'll work out for you. It'll work out well for you. Just as you will have learned a lot of Torah, you will be repaid well. And it'll match up. And you should trust that your employer will pay you the repayment, the remuneration of your work, that you will be paid for your efforts, which echoes what we had seen two videos ago from Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, echoing the same statements. And I believe that even though Rabbi Tarfon was not a contemporary of Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, that is why these two statements of Rabbi Tarfon are placed here juxtaposed to Rabbi Elazar ben Arach's statement. And now we get to the third statement, third piece of Rabbi Tarfon's statement. And I do want to point out that whereas we had seen in the previous text where it was a statement of Rabbi Tarfon's, this is kicks off by saying this is something that he used to say, making it seem like a common phrase, a common expression, a common saying of Rabbi Tarfon. And here's the third. You should know that the grant of reward unto the righteous is in the time to come. That'll come in the future. Meaning, what the righteous do, the sacrifices they give up in their own lives, that will be maybe not fully remunerated right now in this world, right here, but at some point in the future. It's not which is really fascinating, because in the second part of his statement, he had talked about you will be rewarded for the Torah that you study, but going further, for the righteous, what they give up, maybe not so much in the here and now. This really all is couched within, as an not just being a rabbi, but really an aspiring religious individual, right? We saw in the first piece, or heard in the first piece, you don't feel like you need to be a completionist, that you need to do everything, but at the same time, don't give up, right? Just because you can't be a completionist and do everything, still keep at it. Don't give up. The second is really interesting. Yeah, you may have studied a lot of Torah, but guess what? You'll be repaid in some fashion. maybe not financially, but in some way you will be rewarded for that commensurately. It'll make sense. And then, and you should trust, which is really interesting. It's an interesting addition. You should trust that your employer will pay you for what you've toiled, for what you've actually done. They will pay you. And again, this is all not meant to be taken literally financially. Rather, it should be taken as far as you're studying Torah, you're going to be repaid in some form. Really quite unclear what that is. And again, this interesting piece about the righteous. So Rabbi Tarfon here, he just sort of like he had mentioned in his previous statement, and like we had seen in the third of Rabbi Elazar ben Arach's wisdom advice, he talks about being repaid. Which, by the way, just to point out, we had seen in the first chapter from Pirkei Avot that one of the sages had said, don't expect payment. Don't do it in order to be rewarded for what one endeavors in a religious fashion. But Rabbi Tarfon says, no, you should, you'll get rewarded. You'll be, trust that what you put in now, which it's interesting. What you're going to put in now, it's one thing for studying Torah, you'll be repaid at some point. But for the righteous, what they give up, that's even further on down the line. Really interesting. Rabbi Tarfon is such an interesting character. I mentioned yesterday, he lives a little bit later than the students that we've heard from of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He is around the turn of the 2nd century, really into the early part of the 2nd century. So I'm very excited. Thank you so much for this 2nd chapter, and I'm looking forward to beginning the 3rd chapter of Pirkei Avot soon. All right, thank you so much for watching.